At 8 o'clock on the evening of the 20th of May, all the 6 batteries of the N Reserve Artillery Brigade halted for the night in the village of Myastechki on their way to camp. When the general commotion was at its height, while some officers were busily occupied around the guns, while others, gathered together in the square near the church enclosure, were listening to the quartermasters, a man in civilian dress, riding a strange horse, came into sight round the church. The little dun-colored horse with a good neck and a short tail came, moving not straight forward, but as it were sideways, with a sort of dance step, as though it were being lashed about the legs. When he reached the officers, the man on the horse took off his hat and said, "His Excellency Lieutenant General von Ryabovitch invites the gentleman to drink tea with him this minute." The horse turned, danced, and retired sideways. The messenger raised his hat once more, and in an instant disappeared with his strange horse behind the church. "What the devil does it mean?" grumbled some of the officers, dispersing to their quarters. "One is sleepy, and here this von Ryabovitch with his tea. We know what tea means." The officers of all the 6 batteries remembered vividly an incident of the previous year, when during maneuvers they, together with the officers of a Cossack regiment, were in the same way invited to tea by a count who had an estate in the neighborhood and was a retired army officer. The hospitable and genial count made much of them, fed them, and gave them drink, refused to let them go to their quarters in the village, and made them stay the night. All that, of course, was very nice. Nothing better could be desired, but the worst of it was, the old army officer was so carried away by the pleasure of the young men's company that till sunrise he was telling the officers anecdotes of his glorious past, taking them over the house, showing them expensive pictures, old engravings, rare guns, reading them autograph letters from great people, while the weary and exhausted officers looked and listened, longing for their beds and yawning in their sleeves. When at last their host let them go, it was too late for sleep. Might not this von Ryabovitch be just such another? Whether he were or not, there was no help for it. The officers changed their uniforms, brushed themselves, and went all together in search of the gentleman's house. In the square by the church they were told they could get to His Excellency's by the lower path, going down behind the church to the river, going along the bank to the garden, and there an avenue would take them to the house. Or by the upper way, straight from the church by the road which, half a mile from the village, led right up to His Excellency's granaries. The officers decided to go by the upper way. What von Ryabovitch is it? They wondered on the way. Surely not the one who was in command of the N Cavalry Division at Plevna? No, that was not von Ryabovitch, but simply Rab and no Vonge. What lovely weather! At the first of the granaries the road divided in two. One branch went straight on and vanished in the evening darkness, the other led to the owner's house on the right. The officers turned to the right and began to speak more softly. On both sides of the road stretched stone granaries with red roofs, heavy and sullen-looking, very much like barracks of a district town. Ahead of them gleamed the windows of the manor house. "A good omen, gentlemen," said one of the officers. "Our setter is the foremost of all, no doubt he scents game ahead of us." Lieutenant Lobitko, who was walking in front, a tall and stalwart fellow, though entirely without mustache, he was over 25, yet for some reason there was no sign of hair on his round, well-fed face. Renowned in the brigade for his peculiar faculty for divining the presence of women at a distance, turned round and said, "Yes, there must be women here. I feel that by instinct." On the threshold the officers were met by von Ryabovitch himself, a comely-looking man of 60 in civilian dress. Shaking hands with his guests, he said that he was very glad and happy to see them, but begged them earnestly for God's sake to excuse him for not asking them to stay the night. 2 sisters with their children, some brothers and some neighbors, had come on a visit to him, so that he had not one spare room left. The general shook hands with everyone, made his apologies and smiled, but it was evident by his face that he was by no means so delighted as their last year's count, and that he had invited the officers simply because, in his opinion, it was a social obligation to do so. And the officers themselves, as they walked up the softly carpeted stairs, as they listened to him, felt that they had been invited to this house simply because it would have been awkward not to invite them, and at the sight of the footmen, who hastened to light the lamps in the entrance below and in the anteroom above, they began to feel as though they had brought uneasiness and discomfort into the house with them. In a house in which 2 sisters and their children, brothers, and neighbors were gathered together. At the entrance to the drawing room the officers were met by a tall, graceful old lady with black eyebrows and a long face, very much like the Empress Eugenie, smiling graciously and majestically. She said she was glad and happy to see her guests, and apologized that her husband and she were on this occasion unable to invite Messrs. less officers to stay the night. From her beautiful majestic smile, which instantly vanished from her face every time she turned away from her guests, it was evident that she had seen numbers of officers in her day, that she was in no humor for them now, and if she invited them to her house and apologized for not doing more, it was only because her breeding and position in society required it of her. When the officers went into the big dining room, there were about a dozen people, men and ladies, young and old, sitting at tea at the end of a long table. A group of men was dimly visible behind their chairs, wrapped in a haze of cigar smoke, and in the midst of them stood a lanky young man with red whiskers, talking loudly with a lisp in English. Through a door beyond the group could be seen a light room with pale blue furniture. "Gentlemen, there are so many of you that it is impossible to introduce you all," said the general in a loud voice, trying to sound very cheerful. "Make each other's acquaintance, gentlemen, without any ceremony." The officers, some with very serious and even stern faces, others with forced smiles, and all feeling extremely awkward, somehow made their bows and sat down to tea. The most ill at ease of them all was Ryabovitch, a little officer in spectacles, with sloping shoulders, and whiskers like a lynx's, while some of his comrades assumed a serious expression, while others wore forced smiles. His face, his lynx-like whiskers, and spectacles seemed to say, "I am the shyest, most modest, and most undistinguished officer in the whole brigade." At first, on going into the room and sitting down to the table, he could not fix his attention on any one face or object. The faces, the dresses, the cut-glass decanters of brandy, the steam from the glasses, the molded cornices, all blended in one general impression that inspired in Ryabovitch alarm and a desire to hide his head. Like a lecturer making his first appearance before the public, He saw everything that was before his eyes, but apparently only had a dim understanding of it. Among physiologists, this condition, when the subject sees but does not understand, is called psychical blindness. After a little while, growing accustomed to his surroundings, Ryabovitch saw clearly and began to observe. As a shy man, and used to society, what struck him first was that in which he had always been deficient, namely, the extraordinary boldness of his new acquaintances. Von Rabeck, his wife, two elderly ladies, a young lady in a lilac dress, and the young man with the red whiskers, who was, it appeared, a younger son of von Rabeck, very cleverly, as though they had rehearsed it beforehand, took seats between the officers, and at once got up a heated discussion in which the visitors could not help taking part. The lilac young lady hotly asserted that the artillery had a much better time than the cavalry and the infantry, while von Rabeck and the elderly ladies maintained the opposite. A brisk interchange of talk followed. Ryabovitch watched the lilac young lady who argued so hotly about what was unfamiliar and utterly uninteresting to her, and watched artificial smiles come and go on her face. Von Rabeck and his family skillfully drew the officers into the discussion, and meanwhile kept a sharp lookout over their glasses and mouths, to see whether all of them were drinking, whether all had enough sugar, why someone was not eating cakes or not drinking brandy. And the longer Ryabovitch watched and listened, the more he was attracted by this insincere but splendidly disciplined family. After tea the officers went into the drawing-room. Lieutenant Lobitko's instinct had not deceived him. There were a great number of girls and young married ladies. The setter lieutenant was soon standing by a very young, fair girl in a black dress, and bending down to her jauntily, as though leaning on an unseen sword, smiled and shrugged his shoulders coquettishly. He probably talked very interesting nonsense, for the fair girl looked at his well-fed face condescendingly and asked indifferently, "Really?" And from that uninterested "really," the setter, had he been intelligent, might have concluded that she would never call him to heel. The piano struck up, the melancholy strains of a valse floated out of the wide-open windows, and every one, for some reason, remembered that it was spring, a May evening. Every one was conscious of the fragrance of roses, of lilac, and of the young leaves of the poplar. Ryabovitch, in whom the brandy he had drunk made itself felt, under the influence of the music stole a glance towards the window, smiled, and began watching the movements of the women, and it seemed to him that the smell of roses, of poplars, and lilac came not from the garden, but from the ladies' faces and dresses. Von Rabeck's son invited a scraggy-looking young lady to dance, and waltzed round the room twice with her. Lobitko, gliding over the parquet floor, flew up to the lilac young lady and whirled her away. Dancing began. Ryabovitch stood near the door among those who were not dancing and looked on. He had never once danced in his whole life, and he had never once in his life put his arm round the waist of a respectable woman. He was highly delighted that a man should in the sight of all take a girl he did not know round the waist and offer her his shoulder to put her hand on, but he could not imagine himself in the position of such a man. There were times when he envied the boldness and swagger of his companions and was inwardly wretched. The consciousness that he was timid, that he was round-shouldered and uninteresting, that he had a long waist and lynx-like whiskers, had deeply mortified him, But with years he had grown used to this feeling, and now, looking at his comrades dancing or loudly talking, he no longer envied them, but only felt touched and mournful. When the quadrille began, young von Ryabovitch came up to those who were not dancing and invited 2 officers to have a game at billiards. The officers accepted and went with him out of the drawing room. Ryabovitch, having nothing to do and wishing to take part in the general movement, slouched after them. From the big drawing room they went into the little drawing room, then into a narrow corridor with a glass roof, and thence into a room in which on their entrance 3 sleepy-looking footmen jumped up quickly from the sofa. At last, after passing through a long succession of rooms, young von Ryabovitch and the officers came into a small room where there was a billiard table. They began to play. Ryabovitch, who had never played any game but cards, stood near the billiard table and looked indifferently at the players, while they in unbuttoned coats, with cues in their hands, stepped about, made puns, and kept shouting out unintelligible words. The players took no notice of him, and only now and then one of them, shoving him with his elbow or accidentally touching him with the end of his cue, would turn round and say pardon. Before the first game was over he was weary of it, and began to feel he was not wanted and in the way. He felt disposed to return to the drawing room, and he went out. On his way back he met with a little adventure. When he had gone halfway he noticed he had taken a wrong turning. He distinctly remembered that he ought to meet 3 sleepy footmen on his way, but he had passed 5 or 6 rooms, and those sleepy figures seemed to have vanished into the earth. Noticing his mistake, he walked back a little way and turned to the right. He found himself in a little dark room which he had not seen on his way to the billiard room. After standing there a little while, he resolutely opened the first door that met his eyes, and walked into an absolutely dark room. Straight in front could be seen the crack in the doorway through which there was a gleam of vivid light. From the other side of the door came the muffled sound of a melancholy mazurka. Here too, as in the drawing room, the windows were wide open and there was a smell of poplars, lilac and roses. Ryabovitch stood still in hesitation. At that moment, to his surprise, he heard hurried footsteps and the rustling of a dress. A breathless feminine voice whispered at last, and 2 soft, fragrant, unmistakably feminine arms were clasped about his neck. A warm cheek was pressed to his cheek, and simultaneously there was the sound of a kiss. But at once the bestower of the kiss uttered a faint shriek and skipped back from him, as it seemed to Ryabovitch, with aversion. He too almost shrieked and rushed towards the gleam of light at the door. When he went back into the drawing room his heart was beating and his hands were trembling so noticeably that he made haste to hide them behind his back. At first he was tormented by shame and dread that the whole drawing room knew that he had just been kissed and embraced by a woman. He shrank into himself and looked uneasily about him, but as he became convinced that people were dancing and talking as calmly as ever, he gave himself up entirely to the new sensation which he had never experienced before in his life. Something strange was happening to him. His neck, round which soft fragrant arms had so lately been clasped, seemed to him to be anointed with oil. On his left cheek near his mustache where the unknown had kissed him there was a faint chilly tingling sensation as from peppermint drops. And the more he rubbed the place the more distinct was the chilly sensation. All over, from head to foot, he was full of a strange new feeling which grew stronger and stronger. He wanted to dance, to talk, to run into the garden, to laugh aloud. He quite forgot that he was round-shouldered and uninteresting, that he had lynx-like whiskers and an undistinguished appearance. That was how his appearance had been described by some ladies whose conversation he had accidentally overheard. When von Rabeck's wife happened to pass by him, he gave her such a broad and friendly smile that she stood still and looked at him inquiringly. "I like your house immensely," he said, setting his spectacles straight. The general's wife smiled and said that the house had belonged to her father. Then she asked whether his parents were living, whether he had long been in the army, why he was so thin, and so on. After receiving answers to her questions, she went on, and after his conversation with her his smiles were more friendly than ever, and he thought he was surrounded by splendid people. At supper Ryabovitch ate mechanically everything offered him, drank, and without listening to anything, tried to understand what had just happened to him. The adventure was of a mysterious and romantic character, but it was not difficult to explain it. No doubt some girl or young married lady had arranged a tryst with someone in the dark room, had waited a long time, and being nervous and excited had taken Ryabovitch for her hero. This was the more probable as Ryabovitch had stood still hesitating in the dark room. So that he, too, had seemed like a person expecting something. This was how Ryabovitch explained to himself the kiss he had received. And who is she, he wondered, looking round at the women's faces. She must be young, for elderly ladies don't give rendezvous. That she was a lady, one could tell by the rustle of her dress, her perfume, her voice. His eyes rested on the lilac young lady, and he thought her very attractive. She had beautiful shoulders and arms, a clever face, and a delightful voice. Ryabovitch, looking at her, hoped that she and no one else was his unknown. But she laughed somehow artificially and wrinkled up her long nose, which seemed to him to make her look old. Then he turned his eyes upon the fair girl in a black dress. She was younger, simpler, and more genuine. Had a charming brow, and drank very daintily out of her wineglass. Ryabovitch now hoped that it was she. But soon he began to think her face flat, and fixed his eyes upon the one next her. It's difficult to guess, he thought, musing. If one takes the shoulders and arms of the lilac one only, adds the brow of the fair one and the eyes of the one on the left of Lobitko, then... He made a combination of these things in his mind, and so formed the image of the girl who had kissed him, the image that he wanted her to have, but could not find at the table. After supper, replete and exhilarated, the officers began to take leave and say thank you. Von Rabeck and his wife began again apologizing that they could not ask them to stay the night. "Very, very glad to have met you, gentlemen," said von Rabeck, and this time sincerely, probably because people are far more sincere and good-humored at speeding their parting guests than on meeting them. "Delighted. I hope you will come on your way back. Don't stand on ceremony. Where are you going? Do you want to go by the upper way? No, go across the garden. It's nearer here by the lower way." The officers went out into the garden. After the bright light and the noise, the garden seemed very dark and quiet. They walked in silence all the way to the gate. They were a little drunk, pleased, and in good spirits, but the darkness and silence made them thoughtful for a minute. Probably the same idea occurred to each one of them as to Ryabovitch. Would there ever come a time for them when, like von Rabeck, they would have a large house, a family, a garden? When they too would be able to welcome people, even though insincerely, feed them, make them drunk and contented? Going out of the garden gate, they all began talking at once and laughing loudly about nothing. They were walking now along the little path that led down to the river, and then ran along the water's edge, winding round the bushes on the bank, the pools, and the willows that overhung the water. The bank and the path were scarcely visible, and the other bank was entirely plunged in darkness. Stars were reflected here and there on the dark water. They quivered and were broken up on the surface, and from that alone it could be seen that the river was flowing rapidly. It was still. Drowsy curlews cried plaintively on the further bank, and in one of the bushes on the nearest side a nightingale was trilling loudly, taking no notice of the crowd of officers. The officers stood round the bush, touched it, but the nightingale went on singing. "What a fellow!" they exclaimed approvingly. "We stand beside him and he takes not a bit of notice. What a rascal!" Listening to this video, you can learn English in days. Learn English through Read is a great way to improve your English. We daily upload such a short English story. To get an amazing story, you can subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much for watching video.